questions later in the rebuttal. So in debates like this, I prefer to discuss how an average reasonable person like myself becomes an atheist rather than fire off a list of bullet points that you'll be able to get online anyways. But I'll try to link it to the common arguments where I can. So I'll just go through them really quickly. Number one, the burden of proof or the definition of atheism. Number two, the problem of inconsistent revelation. Number three, the problem of incompetent creation. Number four, that God is simply unnecessary. Right, so those of you... Sorry, can I have the clicker? Yeah, so those of you who are familiar with debating will know that definitions and setup typically come before the point, so it seemed a little weird that my first point is actually about the burden of proof or definition. Right, so I do this for two reasons. One is that this remained the last remaining major thing which Samuel had problems with from our last debate, and it's very often a point of confusion. Second is because this argument is actually genuinely how I turn out to be an atheist. So what exactly is it that makes an atheist? A lot of people confuse I don't believe in God for I believe there is no God. Right? To make it a little bit more obvious, it's either that you believe that God definitely does not exist, or somebody who believes that there is no God will need to prove why he believes that. And if you can find an atheist who holds to that position, I would really like to meet him. Every atheist I know simply lacks the belief that there is a God, because there are no good reasons to believe in one, and that position has no burden of proof. So when Samuel set up the debate today, very William Lane Craig-like, where he says that there are two parts of this debate, right? One where there are good reasons to deny God, and the second part is that there are good reasons to affirm. The first part does not exist. I'm not going to be doing that today, and you're not going to be hearing any arguments in terms of that today. And this first point basically deals with why. Now, I know this looks like I'm trying to make this very easy for myself, but this is simply how logic works. Some people ask, then what differentiates you from an agnostic? Well, nothing. I'm an agnostic atheist. Agnosticism is a position of not knowing whether something is true or even knowable. So I was agnostic through most of my university life, and I didn't know the term when I was in university. I basically decided at that point that it was impossible to figure out which God is the right one, or even whether he wants anything from me. A long-lost, strong Christian friend of mine who turned into an atheist was the one who told me I was probably an atheist as well. And he showed me this through the Russell's teapot analogy. That analogy is a little bit British, so we'll do a slightly different one here. I'm going to tell you all right now that there is an invisible, huge elephant right in the middle of the room. The elephant has no weight, it makes no sound, you can't see it. It's invisible, but it's pink in color, but it's still invisible. It's completely undetectable to you, but it's real, and it's right here, right now. I can't prove to you it exists, obviously, but can you prove to me that it does not? This requires a slight pause, because many people haven't actually considered this question before. Most types of general negative questions cannot be proven, right? Proof that apples will never fall out, for example. Proof that the human race will never meet aliens. These are negative statements which are basically impossible to prove. That's what agnostic means. When you can't really prove or disprove something either way, you don't know for sure. Right? The saying absence of evidence is not evidence of absence is true, but it's not really helpful when it's impossible to have evidence either way. But then how do you respond to this claim about this invisible elephant? Really, I acknowledge that I could not disprove your elephant, and therefore, despite the fact that your crazy invisible pink elephant is obviously made up, I must now hold an agnostic position towards it. I must not judge you when you whisper to it quietly for comfort and tell me that his name is Andy. And of course, it's a he. And since we're being agnostic about Andy, I would like to tell you about Agnes, the invisible flying monkey, and the fairies in your garden, and so on and so forth. In case you have seen stories about the flying spaghetti monster, the invisible pink unicorn, they are all basically this argument. Right, so the average reasonable person would not be agnostic about Andy or Agnes. Until you offer them evidence or good reasons to believe, they are going to withhold it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why agnosticism and atheism is virtually indistinguishable. It's just a question of labels. Some people do not actually want the label atheist. Now, if you were to ask me, wait, that means you're just not sure? Nope, I'm pretty sure that there's no good evidence right now, and there's no reason to care either way. A very kindly teacher I've met at Interfaith Talks once asked me at our second meeting, have you made any progress on your atheism? Even though that's entirely condescending, I'm still not entirely sure it would be polite to ask her whether she's made any progress herself. The thinking reveals the special position that God has come to take in our lives. He's been shoved in our face so much that we need invisible elephant analogies to realize that that is not how we treat everything else. We even need special terms like atheism or agnosticism. Right? Anyone who tells you something extraordinary or even something perfectly ordinary would be required to carry the burden of proof for it. The same applies to God. None of you believe in Zeus, Amon-Ra, Demogorgon, Thor, the non-Avengers one. Nor can you prove that these entities do not exist. Yet every single one of you are atheists towards these gods. And that does not diminish your open-mindedness, nor does it make you unsure in any sense of the word. Moving on, what good reasons are there for an average reasonable person to reject the belief in God? My second argument deals with the primary reason I got disillusioned in my search for God in the first place, an argument I like to call the problem of inconsistent revelation. Although the topic today doesn't spell it out, but as Samuel mentioned, he needs to justify himself not just that a God exists, but that his specific God exists. There are thousands of religions and deities which he disbelieves just as much as I do, and in the last debate, Samuel mentioned that he studied comparative religion. Well, I try to point out that he did this as a Christian. If you're really seeking the truth, you need to have a zero default position and be ready to follow the evidence where it leads. I started as a Taoist, really confused about how it's often mixed up with Buddhism. I naively accepted Jesus through mail order evangelism, and later came to better understand it through the Catholic Church and a whole host of churches in between, depending on who was inviting. I attempted to heal the sick after attending a charismatic conference. My dad probably remembers that with some amusement. I spent 2 years with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Boo. I checked back with Buddhism in case I missed something. I tried to read some Hindu texts, and I read a translation of the Quran. Each time I was desperately trying to figure out what is true about the world that I live in, and if you apply the same fair skepticism to all of them, none of them actually stand out. Worse yet, not everybody have that opportunity. People in India consider themselves to be lucky to be born Hindu because it's the correct religion. People in America lucky to be born into Christianity, and the people in the Middle East lucky to be Muslim, because your religion has to be the right one every time, right? In the same way that Samuel probably wishes I could be saved, I bemoan the fact that many of the religious may not be able to gain the perspective that allows them to honestly apply the skepticism they apply to other religions towards their own religion. Every religion has complicated explanations for its difficult questions, so long as you receive the guidance of the Holy Spirit or check in with some gurus first. As long as you're willing to engage in some mental gymnastics that rival Olympic gold medalists, it can all make sense. I've done exactly the same thing when I was a Christian as well. So how does an infinitely benevolent and powerful God create a world where confirming the mere fact of his existence or the nature of his identity be so convoluted? What is more likely, that God created us and yet failed to reveal himself to all those average reasonable persons of the world, many actively seeking him, or that in fact we created all these gods instead in our intellectual infancy? My third argument I like to call the problem of incompetent creation. The formulation of this argument is basically describing the world as we currently understand it, and after that exclaiming, and we honestly think that God did all this? Let me demonstrate really quickly. We now have reasonably good evidence that our universe started in a Big Bang which created both space and time. The universe expanded and cooled over billions of years. Some dust got stuck together until they got too heavy. They caught fire. Stars started to form. The stars burned out and exploded, vomiting the periodic table of elements. Other stars ate this vomit. Some vomit ends up being caught by gravity and they swirl around, banging into each other. Earth formed by a couple of billion years of such banging, eventually cooled enough for liquid water. We do not yet know exactly how, but by reproducing early Earth-like conditions and studying how molecules naturally stick together in labs, we think complex molecules gain the ability to maintain cell membranes around themselves. These DNA-based life forms then, through the process of sex, murder, death, mutation, and natural selection, evolved to become better and better suited to survive in their environments. This eventually gave rise to sickly, fragile, but really smart creatures which developed tools and later science, allowing them to discern the laws of the universe, develop technology, and take over the world. All the while they hear instructions from the sky about the right and wrong kinds of sex, struggle to come up with reasons not to murder one another, and elect idiots into rather important positions of power. And we honestly think a God did all this? The past billion of years was for this recent few thousands of years. That 99% of species that ever lived are dead, but yet some species were worth saving in a giant boat. that billions and billions of stars and planets exist so that on this perfectly ordinary one, all important things happen. That some accountant is telling points for your every action to determine if you're going to the good place or the bad place.
Oh man, I'm untouchable.
Though the painstaking efforts of generations of meticulous, self-questioning scientists who have managed to provide natural explanations for the origins of existence, the diversity of life and the laws that govern the physical world. Through all this, we have detected not the slightest sign of a creator, no impossible square stars, no zone of reverse gravity, no perpetual motion machine, and no indestructible tablet displaying cat memes that we only come to understand in the 21st century. Yeah, he's all-powerful, he has all the time, he can make as much Lego blocks as he likes. But the question is, which is more likely? That such a being exists, gives us the capacity to reason, and purposely makes it so we can't reason out his existence, or that he simply doesn't exist. My fourth and closing argument is that God is simply unnecessary. Now, this is somewhat related to my first one. Upon realizing that I was essentially an atheist, it took a bit of time to take God off the pedestal of unknowable where I thought he belonged. In that time, I realized that something that, which is at least true for me. God was an answer that I wanted, but not an answer that I needed. There's a famous anecdote attributed to Laplace, the French mathematician. When Napoleon asked him why, unlike Newton, there was no mention of God anywhere inside his work on astronomy, he replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis." Laplace solved the problem with the planetary orbits which Newton thought required God's intervention, otherwise all the planets will fly off into space. God is synonymous with "I don't know," and that has been the way for some time now. He is applied wherever we have a desire for answers but simply do not have one. When we were nomadic tribes, we asked, "What are the sun, the moon, and the stars?" We answered, "They are gods." But essentially, we didn't know. When earthquakes happened, we asked, "What is going on?" We answered, "God is angry." But essentially, we didn't know. Before the theory of evolution, we asked, "How did this variety of life come about?" We answered, "God made it so." But essentially, we didn't know. And today, we asked, "What triggered the Big Bang?" Many today say it must be God. But essentially, we could be in a hot bubble in an eternally inflating universe, multiverse, or we don't know yet. And that appears to be where we are today. God has been retreating to the next unknown when science explains the current one, and this has been happening for a long time now. This may of course be questions, there of course may be questions where science does not answer, but where it matters, science has so far not only delivered, but has been the only reliable means through which we can figure out how the world works. Is this an argument for the non-existence of God? I think so. And I think it will be more so in the coming years. An uncle of mine once told me that he's not too worried about my faith or lack of it, because one day I will encounter things I cannot explain and face hardships which demand an answer greater than what I can intellectually provide. And that will lead me back to God. Let's face it, we can debate philosophy all we want, but the common man or woman turns to God in the face of a world which is sometimes cruel and uncaring in order to be able to make sense of it all. So this multi-purpose answer, which answers absolutely nothing, probably powers more faith than anything else. I'm not too worried either. I'm entirely aware of the limits of science and logic. Once I understand that invoking God is essentially admitting ignorance, it ceases to be of any importance at all. And the question is, are you comfortable with your own ignorance? We are. You will hear many atheists say, "Until such time as I come upon sufficient evidence, I shall not believe, and I shall live my life on the assumption that He's not there." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my position.